Hello and welcome back to A Better World. This is your host Mitchell J. Rabin, and we're very glad you're joining us again today. Today we're going to have another very interesting show. We have invited back Dr. Bruce Lipton, the author of this book, The Biology of Belief. We have been waiting for some time for this book to come out, since the last time that Bruce was a guest on our show, actually some almost 10 years ago. So we're very glad to have Bruce back again, and he's going to be speaking about the updates in the work that he has been doing that is so interesting. You have to realize that we and our minds are operating on such a level and with such depth as to be influencing our cellular life. Bruce Lipton is a cellular biologist, former associate professor at University of Wisconsin Medical School. He has dedicated his life to understanding the life of the cell, and he has come to us now to tell us about what is really influencing the cell. It's so different than conventional thinking. So he'll be illuminating us about what is really going on, and ultimately the story is one of self-empowerment. So stay tuned. I think you're going to have a really wonderful time tuning in to what Dr. Lipton has to say and share with us. Hello, Bruce.
Mitch, thank you very much for another opportunity.
Absolutely, absolutely. This word needs to be out. I'm sorry that it took us 10 years to reconvene, but
Well, it's been an exciting 10 years because the science we talked about 10 years ago is now becoming mainstream understanding. So the population is ready for this now.
Exactly.
This is great.
Exactly. We were sort of seeding the world back then, and now things are beginning to be ready for harvest.
Well, that's true, and it's also fun for me because, as I said, I came from that scientific background and was reporting on the science that I was observing in the culture. But what's happened in the last 10 years, of course, is actually applying this science to my own personal life, and that to me has been the greatest story of my entire life, is that this biology is that powerful, and that's why I'm really hoping that people get a chance to understand where we're going with the new science.
Exactly. Well, you are really recognized internationally as one of the pioneers in the new biology, and one of the values of the new biology is its personal nature.
Absolutely. It takes us away from being victims, as the old biology would have us believe that genes control our lives, and that as a result of that, then our heredity is sort of our future. It's sort of like our program came in our genes. And of course, the big issue about that is that we didn't pick the genes. We can't really change the genes, and as a consequence of that, then our characters or traits apparently seem to be programmed by these genes. Well, that puts the individual into a position of powerlessness, that, well, what can you do about it? And there isn't very much, and then, of course, we become a little bit more irresponsible, because then we start to figure out that, well, you can't do anything about it, then why even try?
Yes.
And what's really nice is that over the last 10 years, the work that we were talking about last time, which was just coming into the field, has now really established itself in the mainstream science. But the issue for the people in the audience is this, is there are two stories. The stories of how life works if you're a bioscientist, and the story of how life works if you're anything but a bioscientist. Mm-hmm. If you're anybody else, you get mass media stories.
Yes.
And that mass media picture is a picture of genetic determinism, the belief that the genes will determine and control the characters of your life. And yet people leading edge don't have that picture at all.
Well, this is really, and maybe we should just let it be known that just the power of your contribution, which has many tributaries, has so much to do with helping people come out of this conventional thought form or paradigm that everything is predetermined.
Yes.
Genetically predetermined, and there has been such investment in science and the pharmaceutical industry, et cetera, saying that is so. So then, therefore, let's fund genetic research. And you're saying something so radically different, which is that, wait a minute, we, in your observations, and if you would please tell us the story again, just to recapitulate for people, of what you discovered, of why that actually isn't so. You did a scientific experiment that utterly, completely proves the falsity of that notion.
Well, this was years ago, so it's not like, again, current. It was basically people talking about stem cells
so
today.
relevant.
Oh, it's because it's taken that long to come to the forefront, because there was the conventional belief that would actually stall any kind of new ideas coming forward. And we are now passing into a point where the carriers of the old dogma are actually dying away, opening up for all of us an opportunity to see and be in a world with a new science and a new understanding.
Yes.
So I started culturing stem cells in 1967. That was like almost 40 years ago, and people are talking about stem cells today like these are the new things that are just happening. Well, 40 years ago, I started working on them. They were the most profound experiences of my life, is to understand how these cells were carrying out their lives, what controlled their behavior. For the reason was I came from the conventional world of teaching, in fact, medical students that we're like biochemical machines, and genes are so involved with the control of that machine. Then I'd go back in my laboratory and start to realize that the cells weren't listening to what I was teaching. You know, they had their own life, and I started to recognize that something that was so important is that the genetics and behavior of the cell are not controlled or programmed by the genes, but are actually influenced and directed by how a cell responds to its environment, which, if you think about it, is very interesting, because environments are dynamic and always changing. And so how can you pre-program the fate of something in an organism and then put it out in the world, which has no program? It would crash inevitably. And yet what we now know is, no, biology is more intelligent than that.
Yes.
Biology provided a system that was completely and continuously adaptable. So there is no genetic pre-program, so to speak, to control who we are. And that as we meet in our environment every day, and as we deal with our environment and the stresses and demands of our environment, we change our genetic expression on a day-by-day basis to accommodate our lives in an ever-changing world. And so the research that I did back in 40 years ago, part of it was to eliminate the DNA from the cell. And as a process,
you actually remove the
destroy
DNA.
Destroy the DNA. And so that the cells functionally have no DNA. And what's interesting, of course, everybody talks about DNA controlling a cell. Well, when you realize that these cells have no genes in them because all the DNA is destroyed, and yet many of them last, some of them for 2 months with no genes. And in this entire process, they carry out all their functions. They eat, digest, get rid of waste matter. They move around on the petri dish. They communicate with other cells. They avoid toxins in the field. Basically, there's nothing really changed about their behavior or their activities with or without the genes being present. And the fact is, so it says, okay, well, obviously something must happen if you take the genes out, and the answer is this.
Yeah.
When you take the genes out of a cell, you lose the blueprints to make the parts. The cell is made out of parts.
Sure.
Proteins. The DNA are blueprints. Well, the point about that is, at some point, if a protein of my machinery, my organic machinery, breaks down, and I don't have another blueprint to create a replacement, at that point in time, then you'll start to see the effect of not having genes in it. So basically, the genes weren't, in this case, controlling the behavior of the cell. The genes were very specifically this: reproduction. Yeah. And that's the thing that wouldn't happen if you took the genes out. The cells would no longer divide. But all the other functions were completely untouched and completely integrated, and they were carrying on their lives. So basically said the brain of the cell couldn't have been the DNA because there was no DNA in it. So that led me to an understanding of trying to track down the brain. Turns out that the brain of the cell is the skin of the cell. And,
the membrane.
Yeah, the membrane.
It should also be said that what it sounds like, Bruce, is that the DNA is functioning almost on a species-wide level. That its purpose is to perpetuate the continuation of whatever species that cell is participating in, and hence its replication.
Well, that's true, but here's this other beautiful thing that happened since the Human Genome Project, since we met, okay? Yeah. And basically, the idea of the Human Genome Project was, if we came with the belief that genes control who we are and all the details of our life, the idea of the Human Genome Project was, well, if we made a list, a compendium of all the genes, then what we would have is an ability to say, well, if you came to me with a problem, I say, oh, I have a gene that I could fix it. So that the idea of the Human Genome Project is we made identify every gene, a library. Then if you came in with a problem, I could re-engineer you with a new gene. Well, here's the funny part of the problem is that belief about a genetically controlled organism such as a human, in the case of a human, required in excess of 100,000 genes, and many said over 150,000 genes. And the results of the Human Genome Project are in now, and the biggest shock for the biologist behind it was there are less than 25,000 genes. So somewhere along the line, 100,000 genes that were required don't exist, which means really, it's not that the genes didn't exist, the belief was wrong. And now we find out we have about as many genes as the lowest animals on this planet. So
doesn't a monkey have more genes?
Oh, it has as much or more. You know, and we go down to this little tiny roundworm called Caenorhabditis elegans. It's a genetic model because you can breed them and they divide very quickly, and you can do all kinds of experiments. It has 1,271 cells, has 24,000 genes. We have 50 trillion cells, and we have about 25,000 genes. Basically, the belief is...
It's an inverse relationship.
It is completely, and this was a shock to people who had put all their faith in a belief that genes were controlling life, to find out you don't have enough genes to even start there. So you better start thinking of a whole new idea about how it works at this point. And this is really neat because we are indeed on the verge of understanding a new aspect about genes. And what I talked about years ago was something we talked about, the environment controlling genes. There wasn't even a name in that field when we talked about it 10 years ago. The name now of this new understanding is called epigenetic control. Epigenetic. And when we talk about genetic control, that means control by genes. When you say epigenetic control, if you read it, epi means above. So if you read it, it says control above the genes. And all of a sudden we realized, oh my goodness, the genes were not self-actualizing. I mean, people walk around today thinking, oh, I got a cancer gene, it's going to give me cancer, and I got this gene that's going to do these things. And the fact is, we almost give them a life, like an intelligence, like they're thinking like, oh, you know, Mitch has had a rough day, maybe I'll give him a little cancer today, you know, and just make a, you know, like give a decision. And the reality is, genes are blueprints, and this is an honest-to-God fact. They are linear strands, which are blueprints to make the proteins of the body. Why this is relevant is, go back and read the papers. You can even read a paper today somewhere that somebody's going to say genes control this and genes control that. And the reality is, the first thing we have to say is this: what is a gene? It's a blueprint. Why is that important? Because if you really know it as a blueprint,
well, it's a protein, isn't it?
No, it's a nucleic. It's made out of nucleic acids, but it makes proteins. So it's actually like a ticker tape in a sense, with like letters going down the tape, and these letters spell out the sequence of amino acids that make the complex proteins. Well, why this is important is a gene is a blueprint, and it's funny because people talk about a gene turning on and a gene turning off. Now think about it this way: if you went into an architect's office, and an architect is working on a blueprint, and you stand behind that architect, look over his shoulder, and say, "Excuse me, is that blueprint on or off?" And all of a sudden you get a response like, what do you mean on or off? Well, there is no on or off, it's a blueprint. And all of a sudden you stand back and you have to say, you know what? The same thing applies to a human gene. It's a blueprint. There is no on, there is no off. The difference is, just like the blueprints, the architect can have his whole office filled with blueprints. That would be like the equivalent of a nucleus in a cell filled up with all the genes being blueprints. And just like in the architect's office, well, which blueprint is going to be the one you're working on? The one the architect reads. All the other blueprints are on a shelf. Well, in the nucleus, well, when is a gene active? When it's being read. And why is this an important point to make? That you're reading a gene means, well, the active part wasn't the gene. The active part was what was reading the gene. And that makes all the difference in the world, because we were saying the genes were self-active. If they were, that would be tantamount to that architect we're talking about. Drive by a building site, throw the blueprints on the lot, drive away, come back in a few weeks, and there'd be a building there because the genes built it. And the reality is, no, genes are blueprints. They don't turn themselves on. Somebody reads it. There's a contractor, an architect behind all this. The architect is the brain of the organism, and it reads the environment and then says, which genes do I need to engage to make the functions that I can respond to the environment? Nowhere in that process did the gene even have a decision. And so we've gotten to this point that we bought it, the story of genes and the belief so deeply ingrained in us that people just walk around, even scientists walk around and say, well, the genes control this. Yeah. They know at some level that's not true, but it's just so common usage that we repeat it all the time.
You're highlighting a very important point that came out earlier, actually, but I'll underscore it, which is that science itself needs to be demythologized. Science itself is subject to the same slings and arrows of irrational thought processes, emotions, and passion. Scientists are supposed to actually be objective, impartial. I know. See, you laugh.
I laugh because I've been in the heat of the argument.
You've been in the heat. You've been in the academic world.
Absolutely.
You've lived and breathed it.
Right.
And you know how silly it sounds to say that a scientist is impartial, because you know how untrue it is.
Basically,
so what they're bringing is their own biases, where science is, in a sense, the cleansing mechanism to keep us from bringing our own biases. And you helped in this regard, having to do with genetic research, et cetera, and cellular biology, to bring some light, if you will, to showing some of the irrationality to the gene belief system.
Exactly. I mean, it was hard for me because I was teaching the gene belief system on one hand.
You were raised within it.
And I was raised in it, but I was in academia. It wasn't my choice.
You were swimming in the water.
I had to teach because this is what the students had to walk home with. Bruce, you have to teach them these things.
And it's going to be on the medical exams.
Well, that's exactly why you taught them, you know. And then here's the reality. So I teach this, and then I will go to my lab and go look at the cells and think, you know, you guys aren't following the rules, you know, and we have to do something about
cells, listen to your genes, right?
So it basically, I resigned my position because there was a point where I felt a lack of integrity of trying to teach this. And what was beautiful about it was I wasn't on a mission to see something new. I was just trying to understand some observations in the culture. And what was neat about it was that I wasn't a spiritual person. I was teaching biology is machinery, biochemistry, genes. Right. You know, you just get a mechanic, you know, you can change things, fix it any way you want. I was in that belief system and teaching it. There couldn't have been anybody more surprised than I was to recognize when I understood how this membrane of the cell was running it. I
remember you describing it as virtually antennae that were sensing the environment around it.
The surface of the cell is a keyboard.
Taking information and responding to it.
Absolutely. So that the cell has these receptors. Yeah. Well, let's look at our skin. This interesting point so the audience will catch this. Number one, when you look at yourself in the mirror and you see yourself, you're not a single entity as we would perceive by looking in that mirror. I look in the mirror and say, oh, there's Bruce, there's one person. Yeah, well, here's a true story. You are made out of living things. The living things that make you are cells. You're made out of 50 trillion cells. There is no singularity in your humanness. You are a community of cells. Yeah. And what's more important is, well, you look at all the traits that a human has, all the physiological characters and behaviors, and you think, oh, look at the magnificence of a human. Interesting truth, every single cell has all of the functions that a human has. Every cell has a respiratory system, a digestive, excretory, a nervous system, an endocrine system. Every cell even has an immune system. Why is this relevant? It's because we're trying to understand the complexity of a human, but what you're looking at is a community of 50 trillion cells. You want to understand the nature of a human, all you have to do is look at one cell, because all of the traits of a human are derived from that one cell. There's nothing we can do a cell can't do because the cells make us up. So if a cell can't do it, we can't do it.
We are the cell,
so
in a way.
When I started to get down there and look for the brain of the cell, and that's when we said, well, what we were teaching, and what's actually even in textbooks and what are being taught in school at this very moment, is that the nucleus with the genes is a large organelle in the cell. And in the textbooks, they talk about this nucleus as being the brain of the cell. It runs the show. Right. Well, that's why the studies with enucleation, where you remove the nucleus from the cell, and the cell still has a life. It says, any organism you take the brain out of and throw it away is going to die. And yet, how can you take the nucleus out and the cells still live? And the answer is, it's not the brain. And then it turns out to be the gonad, which, you know, is always a funny sign anyway, because I have to say it, science is a male-dominated profession, and since they think with their gonads, apparently that they made that the brain as well. But the fact is, no, the nucleus is reproduction. And the skin is the brain. And then you might say, well, if you're trying to compare a human to a cell, would you say that the human's brain is from the skin? I mean, I'm trying to say that the brain of a cell is the skin. And then, but I relate it to the human. And the fact is, well, people think, what do you mean my brain is my skin? The thing was, it's funny because in teaching embryology, what you realize is that an embryo has 3 layers called ectoderm, mesoderm, and endoderm. And from these layers come all the organs of the body, very specifically from each layer, different things. Well, the outer layer of the embryo is called the ectoderm. Ecto means outer, derm means layer. Right. And there's only 2 derivatives of the entire human body that come from the ectoderm of the embryo. And that's skin and the central nervous system.
I knew you were going to say that.
The central nervous system actually started with the back skin, and it was turned in and made a tube, and that was called the spinal cord in the brain. So why is this interesting? Is because, okay, now look, and if I go back and tell you about the brain of the cell, and it's in the skin, then you come back and say, now I can understand the connection of the human brain and the human skin. So we were talking about the fact that the cell has receptors, antennas, that are like tuning forks, that are tuned to environmental signals. Cells, for example, can see calcium or histamine or estrogen or testosterone or glucose or any of these kinds of things. The only reason they can see them is they have a receptor that reads that signal. Well, go back to the human just so that people understand the parallel. Our major receptors are what? Our eyes, our ears, our nose, our taste, and our touch. All of these are sensory organs in the skin. So like the cell, where we have eyes, the cell has protein antennas that see light. Where we have a nose and smell things, the cell has protein chemicals and sees things. So the point is, our brain, the cell's brain, exactly the same thing. What's the nature of it? How does it work? Same between cell and human. Whatever environmental signals are out there, which is the organism has to live in that environment, it reads the signals through the receptors and then interprets those signals by using the signals to control the functions of the cells. So in the certain signal, the cell will move to a signal. Another signal will cause the cell to move away from it. So it wasn't there was a program in the genes. The cells were dynamically orchestrating their lives and selecting their genes by whatever was in their environment. So the cells perceive the world, and in that perception adjust their behavior and adjust their genes
accordingly.
And then, of course, when we wrote the book called The Biology of Belief, why was it called Biology of Belief? And the answer is very simple to this, is that sometimes our perceptions are right, and sometimes our perceptions are wrong. Yeah. So collectively, our perceptions, by definition, represent beliefs. That's right. So our perceptions run our biology, but since we can operate from a misperception just as well as from a perception, and unfortunately, with a misperception, misprogram your behavior and misprogram your genes. And that's why all of a sudden you realize, oh my goodness, if you have beliefs of a scary, threatening world, you change your biology and you actually weaken yourself. Exactly. And if you believe the world is supporting you and helping you, you're open to the world, assimilate it, take it in, and you become healthy. So the point about it is perception runs biology, and sometimes our perceptions are right and sometimes they're wrong. So biology of belief is here.
Take your pick.
Well, that's it.
As Einstein said, apparently, the central question for anyone to ask themselves is the universe friendly?
Yeah, and unfortunately, a lot of people tell us it's not.
If you answer affirmatively,
yes,
your entire biology will follow accordingly.
Exactly.
And if you answer in the negative, again, you will form essentially a psychologically paranoid and appropriately physiological kind of response to that interpretation. But the point is that it's an interpretation, and the body follows. The Chinese have an old idea, which they say the yi follows the qi, and the qi moves the body. The E, meaning the mind, actually,
Yes.
moves the chi, which is the life force.
Yes.
And the chi then moves the body. So what's going on in the E ultimately is affecting everything else. So when you have a certain right idea about something that's in accordance with the nature of things, things will flow as with the Tao.
Absolutely.
And if not, you will get congestion, blockage, etc.
East meets west.
Yes, exactly.
That's exactly what the new science is bringing in. It's bringing the environment, the terrain, into the picture.
And since you mentioned that, a closing thought that I actually want to share, because we will continue with this wonderful conversation because we must. But I would like to leave the viewers with this thought, and you, which is the parallel between all that you've been saying so well about the relationship of genetic thinking among scientists for all of these decades, and what the truth is, if you will, and what you've discovered. That's what I'm calling the truth. And what happened with Louis Pasteur way back at the turn of the 19th century when he proposed the germ theory. And his antagonist, Beauchamp, said, no, 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 no. It's the terrain, dummy. It's not the germs, but the pharmaceutical industry seized upon the idea of the germ theory because they said, oh my God, we can come up with a different medicine, a different medication for every single germ. And there are millions of them.
Millions.
It was a total party. But the truth was, and of course Louis Pasteur rescinded on his deathbed and admitted that he knew the truth after the Pasteur Institute in Paris was established and he was very wealthy, etc., that his antagonist, Beauchamp, his colleague, was right.
Absolutely.
So what we see is there is this intimate relationship between science and economy. And it must be recognized. And I actually realized that there is a psychological survival mechanism involved of why that relationship is actually organic. It's not passing. It's not glimpsing. It's organic. But we'll pick up on this when we return.
That's great. That's wonderful.
Bruce, thank you so much. You're
Thanks
such
for
a
this
gem.
opportunity.
I love your work.
Thanks.
God bless. This is Mitchell J. Rabin for A Better World. Thanks so much for joining us. We've been speaking with Dr. Bruce Lipton, the author of The Biology of Belief. You should really pick it up and get acquainted. Thanks so much for joining us, and I look forward to seeing you next week.